Together, we hold the future of the nation and the conscience of the nation in our hands. Because this year is an election year, it will be a time of great pressure. If we yield to that pressure and fail to deal seriously with the historic challenges that we face, we will have failed the trust of millions of Americans and shaken the confidence they have a right to place in us, in their government.
The Democratic National Committee is trying to solve a spy mystery. It began before dawn Saturday when 5 intruders were captured by police inside the offices of the committee in Washington. The 5 men carried cameras and apparently had planted electronic bugs. One of them had several crisp new $100 bills in his pocket. The police said they were thoroughly professional. The suspects are saying nothing. The Democrats say they have no idea who would want to spy on them.
Mr. Nixon says emphatically that the White House is in no way involved in the burglary and bugging of the Democratic headquarters, and he'll have no further comment on that matter.
Thinks the best surprise is no surprise. You know you'll get a reservation you can count on, and a big, comfortable room.
At first, it was called the Watergate Caper. 5 men, apparently caught in the act of burglarizing and bugging Democratic headquarters in Washington. But the episode grew steadily more sinister. No longer a caper, but the Watergate Affair, escalating finally into charges of a high-level campaign of political sabotage and espionage, apparently unparalleled in American history.
Call Roto-Rooter, that's the name, and away go trouble.
Mr. Nixon made these points. He admits that overzealous workers in his own re-election committee may have been involved in the Watergate bugging caper. And for the first time, the president admitted that the White House has investigated on its own. And he says that it found no one now employed by his administration to have been involved in any way.
The Washington Post reported today that Attorney General Kleindienst, in an interview, pledged a comprehensive, unbiased investigation of the break-in at Democratic National Committee headquarters on June 17th. The Post said Kleindienst promised the most thorough investigation since that of the assassination of President Kennedy. The Washington Post reported today that the FBI has established that high Republican officials had ordered a major political campaign of spying and sabotage against the Democrats to reassure President Nixon's re-election this year. And as part of that campaign, said the Post, the Democratic National Headquarters was bugged with electronic surveillance equipment last June. That was the so-called Watergate affair. But according to the newspaper, that was only one phase of a much more ambitious effort by the Republican hierarchy. Details from ABC's Sam Donaldson.
The Post says the espionage operation on the president's behalf was called the Offensive Security Program. It began in 1971, according to the newspaper, and was aimed first at the major contenders for the Democratic presidential nomination. Its goal, infiltration and subversion. The Post reports that a former Treasury Department lawyer, Donald Segretti, attempted to recruit at least 3 persons as agent provocateurs.
Conspiracy of silence.
The Senate tonight voted 77-0 to establish a select committee to investigate alleged political espionage in last year's election campaign. That includes the Watergate bugging case. The committee will be headed by North Carolina Democrat Sam Ervin. Watergate defendant James McCord talked with Senate investigators privately twice over the weekend, and today reports of what he may have said are beginning to trickle out. The Los Angeles Times reported today that McCord implicated 2 Nixon aides in the break-in and attempted bugging of the Democratic National Committee offices in the Watergate. The Times says McCord asserted that former Nixon campaign director Jeb Magruder and White House counsel John Dean both had prior knowledge of the break-in. Magruder today denied all prior knowledge of the incident. Dean personally has not made any public comment, but today the White House swiftly came to his defense. We have a series of reports. First, ABC White House correspondent Bill Gill.
The White House stands firm on its claim that John Dean is innocent of any wrongdoing in the Watergate affair. News Secretary Ronald Ziegler placed the president's personal prestige behind Dean's defense.
This morning, President Nixon talked to John Dean, And following that conversation, I can again this morning absolutely deny the fact that Mr. Dean had any prior knowledge of the Watergate matter. It's simply a false report. Also this morning, I'm authorized to express, on behalf of the President, total confidence in Mr. Dean, and again to state to you that any report that Mr. Dean had prior knowledge of the Watergate matter is totally false.
Perhaps you haven't been telling the truth, Pinocchio.
Perhaps. Then the President dropped the second shoe, saying in effect that he now believes through a subsequent investigation that his previous Watergate investigation conducted by John Dean was full of holes.
According to well-placed White House sources, Jeb Magruder has told all in the Watergate burglary. Privately confirming stories carried in today's Washington Post, these sources say that Magruder has told federal investigators that he attended a meeting in the office of then Attorney General John Mitchell in February of last year, where he says the Watergate break-in was plotted by Mitchell, G. Gordon Liddy, and John Dean III, personal counselor to President Nixon. Magruder is alleged to have told investigators that Mitchell also arranged payoffs to the convicted Watergate burglars in attempts to buy their silence.
The man in the center of the Watergate swirl here at the White House moved independently of the Oval Office today and issued a statement with the tone of a warning. John Dean acted following overnight news reports leaked from within the White House which pointed an accusing finger at him. The brief written statement says in part, and I quote, "Some may hope or think that I will become a scapegoat in the Watergate case. Anyone who believes this does not know me, know the true facts, nor understand our system of justice," unquote, John Dean. The statement caught White House News Secretary Ron Ziegler by surprise, a tactic with a clear message that Dean is ready to go to reporters himself if news leaks implicating him aren't plugged. Ziegler responded somewhat defensively, saying the President is not trying to find a scapegoat, but is searching for the truth.
10 months and 13 days after it happened, the Watergate affair finally produced some specific actions by the President. Today, he accepted the resignations of 3 of his closest aides and his Attorney General. In no case was there an admission of guilt or even of involvement, but all cases were direct results of Watergate. We have reports first from ABC White House correspondent Tom Jarrell.
Out is H.R. Haldeman, Chief of Staff. The crew-cut, hard-driving former West Coast advertising executive recruited most of the key staff members who implemented the President's daily decisions. As doorkeeper to the Oval Office, Haldeman made many enemies. He claimed he resigned because of various allegations and innuendos raised by the Watergate case, charges, he explained, which had impeded his White House role. Also quitting under fire is John Ehrlichman, chief architect of the administration's domestic programs. When not lambasting Congress for its spending or praising revenue sharing as a concept, Ehrlichman was a key political advisor. He claimed to be victim of unfair public attacks, which he said had left his service to the President damaged, perhaps beyond repair. The initial White House investigator of Watergate, who the President has said gave the staff an all-clear report, John Dean, was fired. Dean is now alleged to have been in on the planning of Watergate and is said ready to implicate Ehrlichman and Haldeman in an attempted cover-up.
Good evening. I want to talk to you tonight from my heart on a subject of deep concern to every American. In recent months, members of my administration and officials of the Committee for the Re-election of the President, including some of my closest friends and most trusted aides, have been charged with involvement in what has come to be known as the Watergate affair. These include charges of illegal activity during and preceding the 1972 presidential election and charges that responsible officials participated in efforts to cover up that illegal activity. I want the American people, I want you to know beyond the shadow of a doubt that during my term as president, justice will be pursued fairly, fully, and impartially, no matter who is involved.
The central question at this point is simply put, what did the president know, and when did he know it?
The world may never know.
Senate Watergate hearings began in low-key fashion yesterday, but today the senators began getting to the heart of the matter. James W. McCord, Jr., the Watergate conspirator who virtually blew the lid off the case 2 months ago by vowing to tell all he knew, told his story in public for the first time. ABC's Sam Donaldson reports.
Now at last, under oath and in public, James McCord, the one-time security director for the committee to re-elect the president, fleshed out the charges alluded to in his letter to the judge. Much of McCord's story had leaked in one form or another, so when the committee began questioning him on the Watergate conspiracy, it came as no surprise to hear the names of former high administration officials. But the high point was yet to come, and McCord made it in a carefully written statement to the committee.
Political pressure from the White House was conveyed to me in January 1973 by John Caulfield to remain silent, take executive clemency by going off to prison quietly, and I was told that while there I would receive financial aid and later rehabilitation and a job. I was further told in a January meeting in 1973 with Caulfield that the President of the United States was aware of our meeting, that the results of the meeting would be conveyed to the President, and that at a future meeting there would likely be a personal message from the President himself.
There's still another Watergate investigation in the offing, the one to be conducted by a special prosecutor chosen by Attorney General designate Elliot Richardson. Today, Richardson named the man he has picked for the job. He is Archibald Cox, who served as U.S. Solicitor General during the Kennedy administration.
John W. Dean III went before the Senate Watergate Committee today and, as expected, gave the committee names, dates, and places involved in the Watergate affair and its cover-up. Included among those names of the names of those having knowledge of the cover-up was Dean's former boss, the President of the United States. We have a full report from ABC's Sam Donaldson.
John Dean came with his wife and lawyers, carrying with him an exhaustively detailed, if sometimes ungrammatical, 245-page written statement. But it was not the grammar that shocked the Irvin Committee. It was the charge that the President knowingly participated in the Watergate cover-up, a charge Dean put on the record in an almost offhand way at the outset.
It is my honest belief that while the President was involved, that he did not realize or appreciate at any time the implications of his involvement. And I think that when the facts come out, I hope the President is forgiven.
Dean claimed he didn't know anything about the Watergate break-in until the burglars were caught. He said it came as a complete surprise to him when the President told the nation in late August that Dean's investigation had cleared White House personnel. In fact, said Dean, what he'd been doing during that period was not investigating Watergate, but on Ehrlichman and Haldeman's instructions, covering it up. Then, reading in a dry, toneless style, Dean leveled his first direct charge implicating the President.
On September 15th, the Justice Department announced the handing down of 7 indictments by the federal grand jury investigating the Watergate. Late that afternoon, I received a call requesting me to come to the President's Oval Office. When I arrived at the Oval Office, I found Mr. Haldeman, the President, and the President. The President asked me to sit down. Both men appeared to be in very good spirits, and my reception was warm and cordial. The President then told me that Bob, referring to Mr. Haldeman, had kept him posted on my handling of the Watergate case. The President told me I had done a good job, and he appreciated how difficult a task it had been, and the President was pleased that the case had stopped with Liddy. I responded that I could not take credit because others had done much more difficult things than I had done. As the President discussed the present status of the situation, I told him that all I'd been able to do was to contain the case and assist in keeping it out of the White House. I also told him that there was a long way to go before this matter would end, and that I certainly could make no assurances that the day would not come when this matter would not start to unravel. The conversation then moved to the press coverage of the Watergate incident and how the press was really trying to make this into a major campaign issue. At one point in the conversation, I recall the president telling me to keep a good list of the press people giving us trouble because we'll make life difficult for them after the election. I told the president about the fact that there were money demands being made by the 7 convicted defendants and that the sentencing of these individuals was not far off. It was during this conversation that Haldeman came into the office. After this brief interruption by Haldeman's coming in, but while he was still there, I told the president about the fact that there was no money to pay these individuals to meet their demands. He asked me how much it would cost. I told him I could only make an estimate that it might be as high as $1 million or more. He told me that that was no problem. He also looked over at Haldeman and repeated the same statement. He then asked me who was demanding this money, and I told him it was principally coming from Hunt through his attorney. The president then referred to the fact that Hunt had been promised executive clemency. He said that he had discussed this matter with Ehrlichman, and contrary to instructions that Ehrlichman had given Colson not to talk to the president about it, that Colson had also discussed it with him later.
Dean says that by March 21st, he was convinced the cover-up was falling apart. And he said he met with the president on that day to tell him so and urged that everyone come clean.
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and that if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it. I also told him that it was important that this cancer be removed immediately because it was growing more deadly every day. I concluded by saying that this is going to take continued perjury and continued support of these individuals to perpetuate the cover-up, and that I did not believe it was possible to so continue it. Rather, I thought it was time for surgery of the cancer itself, and that all of those involved must stand up and account for themselves, and that the president himself get out in front of this matter. I told the president that I did not believe that all 7 defendants would maintain their silence forever. In fact, I thought that 1 or more would very likely break rank. After I finished, I realized I had not really made the president understand because he asked me a few questions, and he discussed that it would be an excellent idea if I gave some sort of briefing to the cabinet, and that he was very impressed with my knowledge of the circumstances, but not seemed particularly concerned with their implications.
Dean said that after the March 21st meeting with the president, it seemed to him the White House now considered him the problem. Dean got a lawyer and went to see the federal prosecutors.
It is. It's all legal. See, no man is above the law unless he's president.
Now it is on the public record, John Dean's damning, if largely unsubstantiated, testimony against the president. Tomorrow, the Ervin Committee begins cross-examination of Dean, and it is sure to be fierce. For nothing less than Richard Nixon's presidency may ride on whether the public believes John Dean or not.
Congress is the only one that's got legislative power, and I don't know anything, any law that gave the president the power to set himself up what some people have called a secret police, namely the plumbers.
If the president could authorize a covert break-in, and you don't know exactly where that power would be limited, you don't think it could include murder or other crimes beyond covert break-ins, do you?
Oh, I don't know where the line is, Senator.
Well, where is the check on the chief executive's inherent power as to where that power begins and ends?
Well, I'm certainly not a constitutional lawyer.
Watergate Committee broke away from its schedule today to hear from a surprise witness. Alexander Butterfield, a former White House aide who now heads the Federal Aviation Administration, appeared before the committee with startling new testimony. We have details from ABC's Sam Donaldson.
Alexander Butterfield was one of former White House Chief of Staff Haldeman's top aides until last March 14th. Many of his duties were conventional, but one of them was not. Butterfield said he was in charge of the presidential bugging system. It seemed that in the spring of 1970, President Nixon ordered that certain of his White House offices and certain of his White House telephones be bugged so that everything that was said could be tape recorded. The bugs in the Oval Office and the Executive Office Building hideaway worked automatically.
And would it be your opinion that those devices would pick up any and all conversations, no matter where the conversations took place within the room and no matter how soft the conversations might have been?
With regard to the Oval and EOB offices?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Democratic senators on the committee agree tonight the pressure is on the president to produce those tapes, or run the grave risk that public opinion will decide he can't because of what is on them.
9 o'clock? 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Fine, it's swell. Well, I'll see you then. Bye. Hope that wasn't taped.
Back to life. New Coast Deodorant Soap. The eye-opener.
It was only last week that the Senate Watergate Committee learned of the existence of tape recordings of President Nixon's conversations, including conversations bearing on Watergate. The committee immediately asked for those tapes, and today it got its reply, a formal official no. Not only to the Senate investigators, but also to the government's own special Watergate prosecutor, Archibald Cox. That set the stage for what may well be the biggest constitutional confrontation in our history. We have reports first from ABC's David Shoemaker at the White House.
Few presidential statements have been so widely expected and yet so guaranteed to create shockwaves. Mr. Nixon's final decision to refuse access to the tapes on grounds of separation of powers was made yesterday in a meeting with his new Chief of Staff, General Alexander Haig, and Ronald Ziegler, both viewed as hardliners in this showdown with Congress. In his letter to Senator Sam Ervin, chairman of the Special Senate Committee, the president admitted that before the existence of the tapes was publicly known, he had listened to them. To quote the president, "The tapes are entirely consistent with what I know to be the truth and what I have stated to be the truth. However, they contain comments that persons with different perspectives and motivations would inevitably interpret in different ways."
This is a rather remarkable letter about the tapes. If you notice, the president says he's heard the tapes, or some of them, and they sustain his position. But he says he's not going to let anybody else hear them for fear they might draw a different conclusion.
The Tonight Show will not be seen tonight, so that we may bring you the following NBC News special report.
Good evening. The country tonight is in the midst of what may be the most serious constitutional crisis in its history. The president has fired the special Watergate prosecutor, Archibald Cox. Because of the president's action, the Attorney General has resigned. Elliot Richardson has quit, saying he cannot carry out Mr. Nixon's instructions. Richardson's deputy, William Ruckelshaus, has been fired. Ruckelshaus refused, in a moment of constitutional drama, to obey a presidential order to fire the special Watergate prosecutor. And half an hour after the special Watergate prosecutor had been fired, agents of the FBI, acting at the direction of the White House, sealed off the offices of the special prosecutor, the offices of the Attorney General, and the offices of the Deputy Attorney General.
6 FBI agents present, impeding our operations right now.
All of this adds up to a totally unprecedented situation, a grave and profound crisis in which the president has set himself against his own Attorney General and the Department of Justice. Nothing like this has ever happened before.
Huh? Sometimes I wonder if there's intelligent life on that planet.
For the first time since the Watergate case began, talk of presidential impeachment no longer sounds like idle chatter. That's a result of the weekend firing of Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox and the resignations of Attorney General Richardson and his deputy, William Ruckelshaus. For only the second time in American history, Congress has passed the point of no return and committed itself to an impeachment investigation of a president of the United States. By an overwhelming vote of 410 to 4, the House of Representatives today gave its Judiciary Committee unqualified powers for an investigation to determine if there are sufficient grounds to impeach President Nixon.
Sock it to me. Obstruction of justice in the Watergate burglary, Article 1, offered today by Democrat Paul Sarbanes of Maryland, but the result of consultations among Democrats and impeachment-minded Republicans. No charge that the president ordered the burglary, but the charge that the president ordered and aided in its cover-up. Article 1 says this presidential policy was implemented in 9 ways. First, by making false statements to official investigators. Second, by withholding evidence from official investigators. Third, by approving and condoning perjury. Fourth, by impeding the investigations of the Department of Justice, FBI, and the Special Prosecutor. Fifth, by approving and condoning the payment of money to buy silence or influence testimony. Sixth, by endeavoring to misuse the CIA. Seventh, by telling suspects what prosecutors had on them for the purpose of helping them to avoid criminal liability.
Eighth, by making false public statements in order to deceive the American people about White House involvement. And ninth, by trying to make criminal defendants think they could expect favored treatment if they remain silent or lied.
Do you have a legislative job of any kind?
No. That's 5 down and 5 to go. Groucho.
Are you a corrupt politician?
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes. But in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
President?
Let others wallow in Watergate. We're going to do our job. That I have no intention whatever of ever walking away from the job that the people elected me to do. I'm not going to walk away. We're going to stay on this job till we get the job done. I have no intention whatever of walking away from the job I was elected to do. I'm going to continue to work 16 to 18 hours a day. The captain's job to bring that ship into port. And I can assure you that you don't need to worry about my getting seasick or jumping ship. I'm going to stay on that helm till we bring it into port. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Wouldn't it have been better to combat that crime legally rather than adding another crime to the list?
Basically, the proposition you've just stated in theory is perfect. In practice, it just won't work. To get legislation, specific legislation, to have warrantless entries for the purpose of obtaining information and the rest, would not only have raised an outcry, but it would have made it terribly difficult to move in on these organizations, because basically they would be put on notice by the very fact that the legislation was on the books that they'd be potential targets. And action's either going to be covert or not.
So what, in a sense, you're saying is that there are certain situations, and the Houston Plan, or that part of it was one of them, where the president can decide that it's in the best interest of the nation or something, and do something illegal.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.